This is the BioCentury Show.
Brought to you by the 4th East-West Biopharma Summit in Singapore. This March, explore how to globalize Asia innovation and connect with key players across Asia's innovation arc, from India to China to Japan.
Hello, I'm Steve Usdin, Washington Editor of BioCentury. There's nothing more promising in the life sciences than the intersection of artificial intelligence and biomedical R&D. Today, I'm going to speak with Vic Bajaj, a scientist who's making that promise real. Vic is a managing director at Foresite Capital and is co-founder and CEO of Foresite Labs. He's director and interim president of Xaira Therapeutics, a company founded last year with $1 billion in investment and the immodest goal of using AI to learn the language of life and transform how we treat disease. Vic is a non-executive director of Genomics England. His resume includes serving as chief scientific officer at Grail and co-founder and CSO of Verily. At Grail, Verily, Xaira, and in his academic career, he's led path-breaking work on multi-cancer detection, digital health technologies, sequencing, applying AI to protein design, and much more. So, Vic, there's so much hype and hope around the intersection of AI and the life sciences. I want to start by asking you to level set. What's really possible today? What do you expect to be possible in the near term? And what are the myths about using AI to create and deploy medicines that you think should be dispelled?
Steve, first of all, thank you so much for having me on your program. I've been looking forward to this for some time. I should correct you first. I don't know that I'm a scientist anymore. I'm more of a recovering scientist. In my role now, I work with just amazing teams of people who are scientists, who do the work and who practice this every day, and I learn from them. My scientific background, of course, is quite helpful, but it's the work that I'm going to talk about is, definitely not my own. So maybe just to organize an answer to your fairly broad question for your listeners. We have heard for at least 15 years that the intersection of AI and the life sciences and healthcare, that is going to represent a fundamental shift in the way that we think about product development. It's only in the last few years, I would say, that the ingredients for that across the board have materialized. One in the form of data from which actual models can be built that answer questions that are relevant for product development. And then second, the demonstrations of how to integrate that into a robust product development process. Those have only happened really in the last few years. So broadly speaking, in drug discovery and drug development, there's a phase of activity where we really have to engage with the biology, often new biology, and understand how to disturb that biology, ideally to cure a disease or at least to reverse the phenotypes that are harmful, that are associated with the disease. There's a phase then where we have to engage those targets with some kind of drug, some modality, as it's called in our field. And then there's a phase where those drugs have to be tested in human clinical trials to demonstrate that they're safe and effective and disease modifying. And finally, we deliver those drugs in the context of many other interventions in a healthcare system where patients are selected according to some factors for a particular therapy based on the nature of their disease. So all of those things have been really transformed in one way or another by larger and larger data sets. And in some cases, we're ahead in applications of AI to those problems. In other cases, they're still preliminary. So probably the best way, if it's okay with you, is to just kind of walk through each of those areas, and I can give my take on where we are, because it's very different in each area. So, in the first case, just understanding disease biology, there's been a shift away from a largely empirical understanding to one that is based on much more mechanistic information about disease. And that's come through developments in novel data generating technologies, particularly sequencing, and the application of those technologies at a scale which is so large that it's relevant. It characterizes the human experience of disease and its genetic and molecular drivers. And that's taught us a great deal in oncology. It's been responsible for the transformation of oncology from a blunt to a precise science where we engage targets that are actual drivers. The genetic rearrangements that are responsible for the cancer in the first place are now engaged by drugs. In common disease, very, very large studies from human genetics have taught us about the causal basis of disease, which genes cause a disease. And it's clear that the evidence of that kind greatly improves the probability of success when you select a target that has a high degree of genetic validation. So none of that depends on machine learning. And the promise of machine learning in those applications is to use other kinds of information that we collect in the laboratory and connect it to human disease phenotypes in a way that doesn't require observation of all of those signals in large numbers of humans. So, an example of that are things like perturbative experiments in the laboratory where you disturb cells, generally genetically, and understand gene by gene or in combination of multiple genes, what are the effects on the cellular phenotype and what does that have to do with the human experience and the molecular and genetic basis of disease in humans. So if you take all such data that the world has produced, as promising as it is, and put it together, it's not enough to build models of biology yet that are predictive in the sense that they teach us about biology, that they get to the biology in new ways, that they teach us things that we can't learn from existing human data sets. But we're at the cusp in companies like Xaira of being able to generate data sets which are massive enough that at least we can test that hypothesis. Can you train and build a machine learning model that has some predictive value in telling you the association and ideally causal link between a set of targets and a human disease? So that's coming. And where the field is now is mostly in using these ML approaches to extract features and correlating them manually with things that come from human measurements. The leap that it has to make is to really build predictive models that teach us about phenomena that are really difficult to observe even in large numbers of people. So that's the first part. I think there we should see a lot of progress in the next few years, building upon what we have done without machine learning and using some of the same data sets, but now paired with a lot of laboratory experiments that generate the kind of data that can be used to train models that predict cellular biology. So that's one area. The second area, once you understand the biology, pick a target, is to engage it with some kind of drug. And, for the most part, machine learning applications there have been, I would say, more advanced than in the first application of really building biological foundation models that understand biology. There, particularly in biologics, the work of David Baker and others has created a paradigm to design proteins, drugs that are proteins like antibodies, completely in silico, replacing processes that otherwise require a lot of empirical screening or even immunization in animals. So that is advanced enough that in our hands at Xaira, not just us, there are many companies and academic groups involved in this. They're practical today, and they're being used to solve challenging design problems and engage targets that would be really difficult to engage using these conventional approaches. Now, for other modalities like small molecules, a general solution of that kind or a design paradigm, a set of things that you can do in a computer to replace medicinal chemistry, that's further behind. And machine learning models have been very useful in predicting the properties of small molecule drugs and accelerating the process of refining them. But the general problem of designing a small molecule that productively engages your target in a defined way in silico, that has not been solved yet. So there we are further ahead, largely because in the protein case, there's a data set, the Protein Data Bank, the PDB, that generations of scientists since the 1950s have curated carefully. And it's a very accurate, very deep, very useful database of protein structures. And so a lot of activities based on those data are ahead just because the database exists in such a curated form. So that's the second area. The third area, which again, we have done in oncology in a relatively straightforward way over the last decades, involves understanding how the drug will work in a particular patient. Well, in oncology, if the drug is targeted, again, to a genetic driver of the disease, then a test of the patient's tumor, which determines that the tumor actually harbors that driver, it's active in that tumor, makes the patient a good candidate for the drug. In common disease, it's much more complicated because the factors that are responsible for an individual's particular disease, its susceptibility to a therapy, are multifactorial. There may be many, many genes involved. There may be environmental factors. There may be proteomic factors. But we are starting to amass enough data, principally through these very large cohort studies involving millions of human beings, that we can actually make predictions now about how these drugs will work in cardiovascular disease and autoimmune disease and many, many common disease conditions. And there, the technology exists today to use machine learning, again, on these very large data sets, and make predictions that will be tested in clinical trials, I would say, in the next year or two.
So it sounds like across all three of those areas, the interesting thing to me is what you really emphasized is the need for more and better data. You didn't talk about the need to have better technologies on the AI side or on the machine learning side. Am I hearing that right? And what are the kinds of sources of data? How do you create that data? Because it's not like for large language models that do chatting where they just can scrape the internet of everything that ever has been on the internet. That's not going to work, right?
No. Data are important, and I highlight that for exactly the reason that you suggested, that in biology, unlike in the world of technology, our product development process doesn't generate enough data to train models, especially in the paradigm or an analogy to the way that an LLM is trained, where you have a phase where the model is trained on enormous amounts of data, and then the model is refined in a task-specific manner on smaller sets of data. So to do that in biology, we need to explicitly generate the data, either in the laboratory or by observing many human beings. So none of this is possible without those data. And in very few biological problems are there really enough data to talk about solving it in a general sense. Generally, we are making much more task-specific focused machine learning models, but that's changing now in biology, models of biology, in models for drug design, designing chemical matter, and in the clinical problem that I mentioned, there's starting to be enough data that those hypotheses are testable, at least. Now, in terms of the models themselves, a lot of what we've done in biology is borrow models, borrow architectures, modify things heuristically from things that are being used by the technology world for other purposes. And it's absolutely going to be the case that more specialized models that are purpose-built for applications in biology, in drug discovery, in healthcare, that is not quite a white space, but it's a broad space that is largely unexplored. And of course, it's very hard to explore that without having the data to begin with and an existence proof that these methods work. Now that that's there, I think you'll see a lot more activity designed to develop specialized model architectures, but more equally importantly, to make what we're doing much more efficient and computationally tractable. You've also seen that over the last 2 years in the LLM world as well, punctuated by the DeepSeek announcement in the last week. But of course, that reflects at least 2 years of progressive publications by those groups and others of the same methods, which then were combined into the recent paper.
Yeah,
so I think you'll see something similar in biology.
It's an interesting phenomenon where you see where people work on things for years, but nobody really hears about them, and then they announce them, and people think, well, they just did it yesterday. But we have to take a break. But before the break, I want to stick with the DeepSeek issue because it's what everybody's talking about. And I'm wondering, does it suggest that the cost of machine learning, the cost of AI, could go down exponentially, and that will give you more capabilities, and that will lower the cost of barriers to entry to do the kinds of things that you're talking about?
It definitely not only suggests that, it demonstrates it, but that shouldn't be a surprise. Any technology goes through a cycle of commodification, widespread release, and especially things that are going to become so ubiquitously deployed, right? So that technology cycle should not be surprising. It's happened essentially with every, certainly internet associated technology, including the cost of computing itself. The other important thing, which may or may not be an overreaction, is the idea that the availability of these cheaper approaches, at least to training, maybe not for inference, we'd have to come back to that's going to reduce overall demand for computational resources. I'm really not sure that that's the case because making it cheaper also means that there will be much, much more widespread use of these technologies and the scale will increase. The consequences for biology are indirect. The methods that were explored in those papers, some of them are useful in the kinds of models that we deal with in models of biology, some are not. But the general principle that once there's an existence proof, people will find new architectures, novel ways to do things with the right data, if there's enough data, I think that's what you should expect in our field as well. Whether or not that's a competitive moat for companies also remains to be seen. Data is definitely a competitive moat, but models and model architectures, in the tech world, they tend to spread very rapidly, as does the heuristic knowledge of how to scale these models. They spread as people move from company to company. So at this point, anyone who wants to set up a LLM company at scale, there's a formula and a recipe and a way to do that. And, Elon Musk is about to demonstrate that.
Well, I'm going to ask you some other things about Elon Musk in a moment. We're going to have to take a quick break, and then we'll come back.
The BioCentury Show is brought to you by the 4th East-West Biopharma Summit in Singapore. This March, BioCentury Bay Helix and Insights partner McKinsey & Company returned to Singapore for the 4th East-West Biopharma Summit. This year's theme, how to globalize Asia innovation from cross-border deals to the new co-model. Meet key players from across Asia's emerging arc of innovation, including China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, and Southeast Asia. Don't wait, deals are closing every week. Register today at biocenturyeastwest.com.
I'm Steve Usdin, and I'm back with Vic Bajaj. I wanted to ask you, you said that there were 3 buckets that you're thinking about AI and life sciences, but I think there's a 4th one. You and I talked about it when we talked before we recorded this show, which is healthcare delivery. And I find it very exciting because anybody who has had a serious life-threatening disease or knows anybody who does knows that healthcare delivery right now, well, it sucks, right? The odyssey to get a diagnosis, to coordinate among specialists, to get insurance coverage, to have the system understand your particular circumstances. None of that works well, even for people who are the most sophisticated people, they all end up in a mess with it all. So it seems to me that that's an area where AI could really, maybe relatively easily or relatively quickly, improve healthcare a lot.
Yes. Well, if we look at applications of AI in healthcare today, first of all, they're growing and widespread, but most are point solutions solving problems that are inefficiencies, nuisances, even obstacles to healthcare delivery, but they're not fundamentally altering the doctor-patient relationship, either the interaction or the kind of information and precision with which a doctor treats a patient. And, as primarily biotech people, we look at all of the scientific advances that are happening in our understanding of disease processes, their molecular basis, their genetic basis, and wonder, as has happened in oncology, isn't this a new paradigm for the treatment of disease? And I would say today the gulf between what we understand as scientists and what we can do in a research setting and what's actually put into clinical practice is enormous and growing. And it worries me a bit. A lot of people are involved in these concierge medical practices. I never paid much attention to that before because, after all, they deliver mostly psychological safety, not any clinical intervention that's unique or beneficial. But actually now there are a set of technologies that really threaten to create a two-tier healthcare system in a way that we couldn't even imagine 5 years ago. And let me give you some examples. Some of them depend on machine learning. And we also think that machine learning is an important solution to this issue, which I'll come back to. Things like the test that we developed at Grail, which has a enormous potential to reduce cancer morbidity and mortality through early diagnosis, is now only in the hands of the people who can afford to pay out of pocket.
And that's a multi-cancer detection, right?
Multi-cancer detection test, yes. Yeah. And will take many years to get reimbursed and in broader hands. It's one example that I was involved in. Or work that we started at Google, which many other people have done now outside of Google, looks at the latent information content of medical images. You can, from a simple picture of the retina, not only detect pathology associated with the retina, like diabetic retinopathy, which is the leading cause of blindness, but actually you can tell a lot about human physiology, cardiovascular fitness, risk of disease, even glycemic control, just from an image of your retina. Or from a simple chest x-ray. Now, you can tell predict somebody's all-cause probability of death in the next few years from a simple chest x-ray, which of course contains very little information that the human eye would say is reliably predictive of mortality, but it is. And from the world of genetics and proteomics and molecular biology, now with a simple blood test costing tens of dollars, I can tell you your lifetime risk of disease. And we've gone from a paradigm in genetics of 50 diseases, not all disease. We've gone from a simple paradigm in genetics where we were focused on what's rare. So if I were to give a large number of people a genetic test, far fewer than 1% would receive something actionable. But now when we can predict your risk of 50 common diseases, then it's more like 75%, 80% of people will receive something actionable, either to change a cancer screening interval or manage a latent risk for cardiovascular disease, or increasingly disease-modifying therapies, even in the neurodegenerative disease space. So that's an entirely new paradigm. And the question we should ask is, how can physicians who have so little time to focus on each patient absorb the volume of information that's coming? Because that will be an enormous barrier. And we think that, this is a opportunity for machine learning approaches to organize that information, make it useful in the healthcare system. And that even beyond that, those approaches are unlikely to fundamentally impact patient care unless they are armed with the right data. going back to the data discussion. In this case, that would be data about the individual. And that is very powerful because you can think of all these technologies as producing a hyper-personalization of the healthcare experience. So pretty soon the physician will be able to tailor a care plan to your needs and your risks, ideally intervening in those risks before they become manifest, even in the form of a disease that you then have to treat when the damage is done.
So it seems to me that to make these things real, it's not just a technology or a science problem, it's a public policy problem. You mentioned about reimbursement for multi-cancer detection tests. There's also issues about, do we have the kind of regulatory environment that we need, for example, to enable AI diagnostics? What are your thoughts about that, and kind of switching to the public policy issues? What should be done, needs to be done in Washington and in capitals around the world to enable the kinds of things that you're talking about to happen?
Well, there are innovative things that have already been done at a small scale. Some have worked, some haven't. And there's a body of policy on value-based care, on making sure that we, as a healthcare system, as a society, reimburse for outcomes, not for just procedures or interventions. There's already a body of policy and legislation related to making sure that healthcare data is made available in a safe and ethical way, to produce models, to judge the effectiveness of therapies in the real world. And there are regulatory paths for all the products that I've discussed, even products that would be autonomous of physicians. The issue is much more that none of these things work efficiently at the moment. And that's a combination of changing the regulatory paths so that they are more efficient. Examples could be through progressive approvals or approval once the risk is limited, by experiments that are designed in the course of care delivery. There are many other possibilities. And it could be also through, on the systems level, many pieces that change incentives so that care can be delivered in the efficient way that I was describing before. But there are just so many obstacles to those at the state level, at the national level. So some streamlining of all of that as a policy approach could be very interesting. One example that a colleague and advisor of ours, who was the former secretary of the HHS, Alex Xaira, has written about a lot, is the simple idea of pricing transparency in healthcare. How's a patient to make good decisions about healthcare without knowing in advance how much does something cost? What's the quality of what I'm buying at that cost? And that information currently is completely obscured from most people. So there are simple things like that, as well as more complicated things in the regulatory process that over time could make an enormous difference.
Well, and actually, so that brings up another thing, that maybe a fifth bucket, maybe it's in one of these other buckets already. When we talk about, you want to know about the quality of things, we don't really collect the kinds of outcomes data about medical interventions that we do about almost everything else that business is involved in now. And it seems to me that it's not going to be possible to have a system that's going to be continuously improving, which must be the goal, if you're not collecting that information and making it available in ways that are useful. Is that something that the kind of technologies that you're talking about could also be helpful with?
Yes. I mean, principally, that rests on data, the idea of data interoperability, right? The overused phrase. But the question is, how do we organize all of the normal, both the detritus that results from healthcare interventions and the actual clinical records and diagnostic tools and everything that goes into forming that clinical record? How do we organize those so that they can be pooled in a statistically relevant way, rather than, in small systems nationwide? And there's a lot of support for that. There's business models that are built upon the idea that that can happen at scale. And as we saw during the COVID epidemic, a lot of comparative effectiveness research, therapeutic effectiveness research, research on side effects and harms can be done, with a high degree of rigor using that data infrastructure. But as we also saw during COVID, there's still, believe it or not, manual reporting of things with fax machines and all kinds of anachronisms in the healthcare system that, that block this concept from being kind of a widespread principle. So it's still the case that there's many things increasingly that you can do with the lot of healthcare data that you can get and aggregate today, but there's also many things that you can't.
So we're kind of running up against the time, and it feels like we've just started. But maybe to end up with, I want to kind of go back to where we started from, which is making it real. What are the things that you think from the companies that you're working with, or the ones that you have invested in and you know about? What are the things that we should expect to see in the next year or two in the near term that are really going to be important for medicine and for biomedicine?
Well, going back to the company that you mentioned, Xaira, which is something that Foresite Labs and Arch, my friend and colleague Bob Nelson, worked on together. That's an example of what you should expect in the new generation of AI companies. So first of all, Xaira is founded at its core with a very high functioning product development apparatus, including Mark Tessier-Levine as the CEO, who was the CSO of Genentech, Debbie Law, who is an amazing scientist that came from BMS and is a long-term drug developer, and others. And that coexists with AI teams and AI projects, some of which, like the work that came from David Baker's group and his lineage, have a decade-long history of validation and increasing success. So that company is configured to develop products. There are things that we have brought into the company that are ready today and contributing to the product development today. It also has a research function that I mentioned, in which we're really generating the data sets to prove that biological machine learning can solve some of these general biological problems. So the fact that all those coexisted in one company is not an accident. We felt, Bob and I and the others involved, that it's hard to create a machine learning company without the crucible of product development in the company. Because if you do that, you begin to even ask the wrong questions and spend a lot of time answering things that may not in the end accelerate the pace with which effective therapies get to patients. So I think you'll see the older generation of companies, they've done great work, pivot now that their platforms have matured. That's happening. In Citro, Recursion, all of these companies are producing products now that have derived from their platforms, and we'll be able to see, it won't be binary, but how well their machine learning approaches have worked and what have been the concrete contributions to product development. And I think as a whole, we'll be, very pleased and surprised by those trajectories. And I think that the newer generation of companies, some are being set up today with a model to serve pharma, but not develop their own products. It remains to be seen if that will work. Our bet is that companies that develop products will win even in the core R&D, and that there is a virtuous cycle between all of those activities, that not only can they coexist, but it's healthy for them to coexist in the same company. So I think that's what you'll see in the field. A lot of companies now that are much more focused on concrete product development problems rather than just advancing the methods.
Well, thanks. Like I said, it feels like we just got started, but we have run out of time. I really appreciate it, and I hope we can, have this conversation again in the future and see how this is all played out in real life.
Yes, I would welcome that.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Brought to you by the 4th East-West Biopharma Summit in Singapore. This March, explore how to globalize Asia innovation and connect with key players across Asia's innovation arc, from India to China to Japan.
Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for the BioCentury Show. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.